Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. The podcast is growing in listeners beyond our wildest dreams. Anthony Loveday, friend and colleague, listens from Cairo, Egypt. We'd love to have more listeners on the African continent and Oceania too. Thanks to you listeners, and thanks to others behind the scenes, including our incredible editor, Sebastian Rosales, who's in South America, who makes us sound better than we really are. In each recording, my colleague Rob Good and I interview an historian about their scholarship, asking them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include a free lesson plan, usually two, that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. So, Rob, what is our topic for today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about teaching the Cold War. Now, when I was teaching, I found it was one of the most important events to teach in my post-World War II units, since the conflict touches everything, domestic, foreign policy, it just runs throughout. And of course, since you and I, Eric, lived through most of it, it reminds me that we're just a couple of old duffers and that today's teachers were born, many of them were born after the Berlin Wall fell. So I'm like, oh, old.
Well, I'm on the edge of my seat or the edge of my duffel bag, as you've identified us as duffers. Is that a saying from like the 18th century? I don't know either. When I taught world history, the ridiculous pacing of curriculum had me teaching the Cold War in about a day. It was a rush task. I actually thought should teach it as the hot war. We had North and South Korea, China, Taiwan, East and West Germany. What am I leaving out? Vietnam. And so it was too rushed, but I digress. Who is our guest for today, Rob?
Today, we are so lucky to have Dr. Jeremi Suri with us. He is one of our nation's foremost scholars on diplomatic and political history. He holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership and Global Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and he has published a wide array of books addressing political leadership in the United States and America's role in world affairs. His most recent book, Civil War by Other Means, explores the struggle over political authority and civil rights that continued after the end of the Civil War. And he's a public intellectual, and he partners with his son, Zachary, to share his insights with fellow citizens through a podcast, This is Democracy, and they have a Substack as well, Democracy of Hope. I subscribe to both of them. I highly recommend them to everybody that's listening, and you will find links to those in the episode notes.
Catch those episode notes. Thank you, Jeremy. So, Jeremy, the question we always ask is, what are the most important elements that teachers need to teach and students need to learn about your topic, the Cold War?
Well, first of all, Rob and Eric, thank you so much for having me on. I'm big fans of everything you do, and I've listened to so many episodes already of your podcast and learned a lot myself. I love the way you put new ideas out there for old duffers like me as well to learn.
learn a trio of duffers.
There we go. Duffs all around us.
Yes.
So I would start with three key concepts from the Cold War that I think are really important historically, but also I think can resonate with students today. First, the Cold War is the continuation, in some ways, the leftover baggage of the Great Depression and World War II. And one of the things I always remind students is that just because the textbook says we're in a new era doesn't mean the old era has gone away. Many elements of the Cold War are new. I'm going to get to those themes as well. But we have to start by understanding that the Great Depression ended because of World War II, but most Americans still believed that the Great Depression was coming back in 1945. They were fearful of that more than anything else. And World War II ended in 1945, but the conflicts between East and West and the insecurity of the Soviet Union and concerns about the rise of Germany and Japan again, those did not go away. And it really took another 50 years for Europe to be reunited. And for Asia, still to this day, as you mentioned already, Eric, Korea remains a divided country. So the first concept is that the Cold War is the unfinished business of the Great Depression and World War II. The second concept that makes the Cold War now different from those is that the Cold War in many ways is about anti-communism, at least for the United States and American allies. Anti-communism as a concept, as a fear, long precedes the Cold War. You can go back to the Red Scares around World War I. but it becomes a central organizing principle of American politics and the politics of Western Europe during the Cold War, because the Soviet Union and later Communist China and then other allies of theirs are seen as threats, not simply because of their desire for territory and resources, but because they seek to infiltrate Western democratic societies and undermine them. Sometimes that infiltration was exaggerated in our imaginations, but it was also real. It was also real. So McCarthyism was a period when the wrong people were targeted and when fears of anti-communism were exaggerated in ways that jeopardized civil liberties. But there still were spies and there were efforts at communist subversion. And that's a fundamental element of the Cold War, the fear of communist expansion. And then the third theme I would put out, the theme that I think resonates most perhaps with students today, is the end of empire and what we might call decolonization, post colonialism, new societies that did not exist as sovereign countries. The cultures, the people, the societies existed, but the countries, the sovereign countries on a map, had never existed before and came into existence during this period because the combination of World War II and the Cold War made it much harder for old empires, particularly the British Empire, what was left of the French Empire in Algeria and Vietnam, various empires, the Belgian Empire in the Congo, right? I mean, those empires were unable to hold on any longer. And much of the Cold War was about figuring out for the people in these societies that had long been repressed what their new governments would look like, and then rivalries from outside, especially American and Soviet efforts to influence those new governments. A society like Kenya or Ghana, those are examples of precisely this.
So that raises a couple of points that I know my students were always interested in. They tend to have a little bit of a critical lens around empire. So I want to start with that last point that you
Sure.
made. To what extent when you teach this with your students, do you talk about how, as these new nations are trying to get their footing, the specter of communism sort of overwhelms? I'm thinking of what happened to Arbenz in Guatemala, or what happened to Lumumba in the Congo. Um, how do you address American actions and possible harms, as well as some of the positive aspects that come?
Sure. Well, I think we have to say that our students are correct, that one of the phenomena of the Cold War was that the United States, although it claimed to support democracy and self determination, and I think most Americans were serious about that, at least in principle, often found itself on the side of those who were trying to limit self determination, especially for societies like Guatemala, as you mentioned. One can think of Iran under Mossadegh as well, countries that were becoming independent and were trying to, first of all, perhaps implement socialist programs, but number two, and perhaps most significant, trying to nationalize resources that the United States wanted access to. This is a big deal in Iran, where the British oil concessions are concessions that quite naturally an independent Iranian government wants to nationalize and control the wealth for. And the United States participates in a coup with the British in 1953 to overthrow the government in Iran, to overthrow the Mossadegh government. That's how the Shah of Iran comes into power, in part because of the fear that this oil would fall into the wrong hands and we would not have access to it. It's not just the economic interest, it's the strategic interest. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that. And one of the things we have to learn from the Cold War is that often our principles can be threatened by other short-term interests. And in most cases, or at least in many cases, when we did things like the coups in Guatemala and Iran, I think we later came to regret it. And that might be an important lesson for us to take. I would also say there are a series of countries that fall in between the communist capitalist divide, countries like India, where my father's from. And India is a society that actually has a socialist leadership in Jawaharlal Nehru, but he's also obsessive about maintaining independence even from world socialist countries like the Soviet Union. And Nehru tries to chart a neutral or independent or third way position. And then there are countries where the United States plays a very important role, I think, in helping to encourage independence in one way or another. Yugoslavia is an example of this, which, of course, was originally formed after World War I from a collection of provinces in the Ottoman and the Habsburg empires, Yugoslavia, in spite of the fact that it had a communist leader in Joseph Broz Tito, became one of the largest recipients of American foreign aid. So there's a diversity of responses. And one of the things I want students to see is not that they should be less critical, but that they should recognize that there are different examples for different arguments. And one of the things we have to learn as Americans is to manage and think of ourselves more humbly, not having the answers for all kinds of societies in all kinds of parts of the world.
That's amazing. I do kind of understand the economic attraction of either the Soviet Union or the United States, Marshall Plan or something like that. That's very attractive to a lot of countries to buy in. You mentioned those sort of strategic plans from Soviet Union or the United States. What could you expand on that a little bit? I'm curious about that.
Sure. So one of the lessons, for better or worse, that World War II taught policymakers in the United States, in Russia, in Europe, in China, was that it meant a lot to have a forward military presence in other parts of the world, because that forward military presence allowed you to exert influence and prevent an area from falling into the hands of an adversary. One of the lessons Americans learned, maybe now we've unlearned it, was that isolationism left us in peril to someone else in Europe and elsewhere taking control of markets and resources, and quite frankly, undermining democracies that we cared and felt a connection to. And so there was an emphasis upon having a forward presence in different parts of the world. And so strategy mattered there. There was also a concern that there were routes and spaces in which goods would have to flow. The Panama Canal is, of course, one of the examples of this, the Straits of Hormuz, all of these examples. And for a long time, really till the early 20th century, for about a century, the British had managed these spaces. And so there were conflicts with the U.S., as all of us know as historians in the 19th century, but we generally relied on these being relatively peaceful spaces. The Americans were concerned that if our Navy didn't patrol these spaces in the 20th century, that they would no longer be accessible for the goods we wanted to sell and the goods we wanted to buy from different parts of the world. That's the long beginning of today, what is called the supply chain problem.
The first 2 points that you made really touch on the challenge that I always felt in the classroom, which was domestic issues and then their intersection with foreign affairs, and sort of looking at the Cold War as the residue of the Great Depression and the anxieties and the fears of that era, and then how those get manifested in the 40s and then the 50s. You mentioned McCarthyism. How do you? I don't know if you actually teach a U.S. survey class,
I
but do
do.
you? So, when you teach the survey class, how do you blend those issues of McCarthyism or the use of communism to sort of be a cudgel to try and limit civil rights movements versus talking about the international affairs that are going on?
Well, I try to move us, Rob. It's a great question, and I struggle with it, but it's a good struggle. I hope, and I hope the students can see that, because one of the things I want them to understand is that there is always a connection between the domestic and the international, but it varies. It can matter in different ways. That it's like a seesaw, right? It can push one way or the other at different moments. I really focus for the 40s and 50s on the concept of fear, and how fearful Americans were of economic decline as well as red totalitarianism, right? They would see as a communist version of Hitlerite fascism. And those fears were fears born of the experience. And it was not an experience they had watched on TV or on Twitter. They had been there. They had been in those battlefields, right? That fear was based on a reality. But the problem with fear is that it can seep into spaces that are imaginary too, and it can be manipulated by demagogues. And so Americans had reason to fear that the Soviet Union was trying to steal atomic secrets and get a lead in the development of this powerful new weapon. They were. But that fear led them to target people who were not, in fact, trying to help the Soviet Union. Men like Robert Oppenheimer, who were actually trying to do the right thing. And it also led them to follow people like Joseph McCarthy or young Richard Nixon, who used that fear to justify attacks on people they didn't like, to justify attacks on Jews and leftists and others. And these are two sides of the same coin. It's not that there was a puppeteer behind the scenes controlling this. It's that fear is a very undisciplined emotion and can be misused, although it is still useful in other ways. And that's really one of the lessons I want them to take, that's what we have to be careful about when we're talking about 9/11, when we're talking about whatever it is we're fearful of today. I think there's a deeper historical lesson in that.
Yeah, that's I remember one of the things later in my career, I started linking the Red Scare to the Lavender Scare, and
Right.
particularly the pursuit of teachers in Florida that were identified as lesbian, and the generalized fear, that culture of fear, trying to get that through, and the relevance of it currently. Eric, you
Absolutely.
looked like you were going to jump in there.
No, that's fine. I'm just happy to listen right now.
So another way I also try to make the connection is then the economic. I focus a lot on fear,
Mhm.
but I also focus on economics because I think one of the lessons that came out of the Great Depression, again, perhaps a lesson we're rethinking today, was that the United States was dependent on the world economy. Americans who lived through the Depression, whether they had any deep understanding of economics or not, they came to recognize that the isolationism of countries in the 1930s made the situation worse. When countries stopped trading, when the United States called back its gold from around the world, it made it harder to do business. And so it's not that they believed in a full free trade world. That's an argument that gets made later. But they did recognize that the US economy was dependent upon other economies for places to sell, particularly our agricultural products, because we grow too much for what we can consume. And also for us to acquire key resources, rubber, for example, which would come from Africa. And so, or Southeast Asia. And so that sense of interdependence that maybe we've lost now, but that sense of interdependence was a key part of the Cold War too, because there was this fear. And I remember these videos even from the 1980s that all of these markets and all of these spaces that we had to at least be connected to, that they would all be painted red and that somehow we'd be left out. And so we had to make sure that we had access to these areas. That's why the United States actually creates the United Nations. Later, we become critical of it, but it's in San Francisco in 1945, and it's Rockefeller land in New York. That's the space for the complex. It's because Americans, even Midwestern small town Americans, believed we need somehow to be able to talk to the rest of the world. And that was what they'd experienced. And that's part of the Cold War as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of growing up in a small rural town in Missouri, and the farm report. I mean, and the grain embargo. All those things were relevant to my friends whose fathers and mothers were farmers and ranchers in that area.
Did the United States maybe overestimate um, the Soviet Union and their ability to influence the world? Was that fear? Was there too much fear in that sense?
I think in retrospect, we have to say yes. In many cases, we certainly overestimated Soviet influence in Vietnam. We certainly overestimated the Soviet influence in Africa and the Middle East. I remember visiting Moscow years ago and seeing the campus of Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, which was designed by the Soviet government to bring people from Africa and show them how wonderful Russia was. Well, it turned out when they came to Moscow, they realized it wasn't, and they realized that Russians were racist too, right? And so, it didn't work. We overestimated their influence, and quite frankly, we had a very condescending view of people in the quote unquote third world. We believed they were much more susceptible to things than they were. I mean, there's a kind of racism in the way we viewed those areas and assuming that they didn't understand what we understood. But that said, the Soviet Union still was a very threatening country in many ways. The Korean War, it provided direct assistance to North Korea and continued to provide direct assistance. And just as North Korea, this horrible regime, is kept in power today with nuclear weapons in part by China, it was kept in power by the Soviet Union for a long time. The Soviet Union had a military that was prepared to move into parts of Western Europe. So we exaggerated the threat, but that doesn't mean there was no threat.
Well, that's a great, I think, as we're coming to a close here, a great sort of way to walk out and think about it's a both and,
Yeah.
right? That there is a real threat, and we have the complexity in history. We have the tendency to overemphasize and accelerate. And as you said, fear is an emotion that just can run rampant. Yeah.
I think there's a leadership lesson in that, if I might. I mean, I
Yeah,
work a lot.
please.
I work a lot with people who are non-historians also and want to learn how to be better leaders and things like that. And somehow they think history will help them. I think they're right,
Yeah.
because history teaches us the both and stuff, right? Our debates are one side versus the other, Democrat versus Republican, right? Internationalist versus isolationist. Leadership is always about finding that space where you're having to blend these things, because the world is never one or the other. And we tend to, when we're poorly led, we tend to either exaggerate or diminish threats, exaggerate or diminish our power. Good leadership is finding that right balance and saying there are things that are threatening, but let's not get out of control here. Let's not go the McCarthyite route and cut off the free speech and innovation that makes our society so good. But let's also not just keep our computer systems open for anyone to steal our data, right? We've got to find the right balance. It's really hard. History teaches us how hard that is. This is what the presidents I admire struggled to do. This is what I think a Dwight Eisenhower was struggling with, which is, how do you balance? How do you have a strong military but not spend your economy into the ground? And those are enduring lessons for us today.
And daily there are teachers that are out there that are doing this amazing job, our listeners, of trying to bring that complexity to their students, and how you shape that for them today is going to be extraordinarily helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, agreed, Rob. Thank you, Jeremy, for boiling down the complex topic of the Cold War into 3 major ideas. Remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. Please be sure to stay tuned, teachers, after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
What a great discussion. Jeremy and I had the same graduate advisor, but he clearly learned way more than I did. Eric, what lesson did you develop in response to Jeremy's observations?
Jeremy certainly did learn more than you, Rob. I focused on the strategic elements of the Cold War that Jeremy talked about over the economic elements. Students will play Cold War spy and investigate any hotspots or active military presence in Germany, Korea, and Vietnam. Have fun with that, teachers. It's a standalone lesson, and teachers, you get instructions with that.
And students love being spies. Well, my lesson focuses on the concept of fear, totally stealing how Jeremy teaches the topic in his survey course. And after all, the master teacher is a master's thief, so I'm fine with that. In expert groups, students analyze one of 5 different fears that emerged in the early Cold War. In addition to the fears of communist expansion overseas, the documents include examples of domestic fears to capture his observation that in many ways, the Cold War was a continuation of concerns that emerged in the Great Depression. The lesson also asks students to assess the extent to which those fears were reasonable and/or excessive. After analyzing one document in their expert group, students then teach each other in their teaching groups. The lesson concludes with a class discussion identifying Cold War fears and evaluating the impact of those fears.
Thank you for listening, and remember, you can download the free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes, and be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts on Instagram and YouTube. Rob will tell you how.
You can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyan20@gmail.com. Historyan20 is all spelled out. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us today.